Have you ever stopped to think about how people in the past answered a really simple question, like, what day is it? Or how much does this cost? Well, it turns out the answers were anything but simple. Today, we're going to decode the surprisingly complicated ways our ancestors measured two of the most basic things you can think of: time and value. And you're about to see just how wild a simple date could get.
Okay, check this out. On the left, a date we'd write today. Easy, right? Clean, simple. Now look at the right. That's from a real document from the year 695. Given on 10 Calends January in the first year of our reign. It's basically a riddle. To even figure out what day that is, you'd have to know which king they're talking about, when his reign started, and then you have to use this bizarre system of counting backwards from the next month.
And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about in this explainer. Why was something so fundamental to us, like just writing down a date, once this complete mental workout? The answer, it turns out, opens up a whole different way of thinking about the world.
So, let's dive in and start by cracking the code on when it actually was. Our first stop is going to be the medieval scribe's desk.
Right, so the first thing you've got to understand is that there wasn't just one system. No way. Scribes would actually layer multiple systems right on top of each other. They'd use the king's regnal year, they'd use that confusing calend system, and then sometimes they'd even throw in this 15-year tax cycle called an indiction, and the day of the week, which, by the way, was often the only way to tell if a Roman numeral was supposed to be a 12 or a 15.
Let's just zoom in on this calends thing, because this is where your brain really has to do a backflip. The calends was the first day of the month. So if you see 10 calends January, you don't count 10 days into January. Nope, you start at January 1st and you count backwards 10 days, which lands you on December 23rd. It is completely the opposite of how we think.
And just when you think you're getting the hang of it, a guy like Charlemagne comes along and makes it even crazier. Some of his official documents are dated to the 14th and 8th year of our reign. Why two numbers? Well, because he was counting from two different starting points. When he became king of the Franks, and later when he also became king of the Lombards. Seriously, every date was its own little history lesson.
So if you were a historian trying to figure this all out, this would be your cheat sheet. First, you've got to identify the king and what year of his reign it is. Then you do all that backwards calendar math. And finally, if you're lucky, you can use the indiction, that old Roman 15-year tax cycle, to double-check your work and make sure you got the year right.
Now, this system we all use today, Anno Domini, or AD, yeah, that did eventually take over, but it was a really slow process. You can find documents from as late as the 10th century where the scribe writes the AD year, but then also includes the regnal year and the indiction. It was like a belt and suspenders approach. They were just hedging their bets in case this whole AD thing didn't catch on.
Okay, so this whole idea of overlapping and evolving standards, it wasn't just for time. It was also a huge deal when it came to the physical world of value and weight. So now let's shift from the clock to the scales and ask a different question. How did our ancestors figure out how much?
And here is the star of our show, the mina. You can think of it as the ancient world's pound. For literally thousands of years, across massive empires from Mesopotamia to Persia, this unit of about 500 grams was incredibly, unbelievably stable. You could argue it's one of the most successful and long-lasting institutions in all of human history.
But just having a standard weight wasn't enough. The real fight was about how you divide it up, and this led to two totally different philosophies. You had the merchant's way, which was all about dividing by two. Makes sense, right? If you've got a two-pan scale, it's easy to get halves, quarters, eighths. But then you had the scribe's way. For bureaucrats doing math on clay tablets in places like Mesopotamia, dividing by tens or even 60s was way, way easier for their calculations.
And you can literally see the difference in these designs. It's brilliant. On the left, you've got this beautiful Mesopotamian sleeping duck weight. It's part of that complex system for scribes. And on the right, a simple, practical lead disc from the Aegean, perfect for a merchant who just needs to get the job done. The shape of the tool tells you everything about who it was made for.
And the stability of that 500-gram standard is it's mind-blowing. This chart shows data from actual inscribed weights that span over 1,500 years, from a Sumerian king all the way to Darius of Persia. Empires rise, empires fall, but that 500-gram mina stays right on the mark. It was a true constant in a very chaotic world.
So the big question is, how do you get from a standard block of stone to money? That's the huge leap, right? from an abstract idea of weight to actual, tangible wealth.
Having a shared idea of what a pound is, that's step one. But to actually build an economy, you have to turn that idea into physical objects that everyone can trust. You've got to make coins.
Take this coin, the Tremesis, from late antiquity. Its name literally means a third of a unit. Its value wasn't just made up, it came directly from what it was. It was 1.52 grams of pure gold, a precise 1/3 fraction of a bigger gold coin. Its weight was its value. Simple as that.
But the math behind all these systems, well, it wasn't always just about being convenient or logical. As this quote hints, sometimes being complicated served a very different, very hidden purpose.
And this brings us to a fascinating point. Why would a government ever choose a ridiculously complicated system like the old Troy pound with its 12 ounces and 20 pennyweights? Well, one really compelling theory is that it made it easier to hide a tax. See, if the government takes a little fee for minting coins, that's called seigniorage, that fee is a lot harder for the average person to notice when it's buried in a confusing mess of fractions. It's much easier to spot in a simple divide-by-2 system. So complexity, it turns out, can be a pretty effective form of camouflage.
So, what does all this mean? Well, these ancient decisions about how to write a date or how to weigh out silver, they're not just fun facts for a history book. They have left echoes that we can still see and feel all around us today.
I mean, just look at this incredible 5,000-year journey. The whole idea of the pound starts nearly 5 millennia ago in Mesopotamia. It spreads and it changes, with that merchant-friendly 16-ounce version popping up in Bronze Age Europe, the pound that's still used in some parts of the world today. It is a direct descendant of this ancient, globe-trotting story.
So, what are the big takeaways from all this? First, creating standards is never easy. It's a long, messy process. Second, some of these ancient systems were shockingly durable. Third, the math tells a story. If it's binary, it's for merchants. If it's decimal, it's for bureaucrats. And finally, never, ever underestimate the power of a complicated system to hide things in plain sight.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. When historians of the future look back at our time, what invisible standards that we just take for granted, what parts of our world will seem just as strange and complicated to them? What are we living by right now that they'll have to work so hard to decode?